fourth grade. We are going to finish adding our lines to our pies, and you should already have your lattice finished. We are going to start on the apple pie next. For the apple pie, I'm going to use my medium brown again, and I'm going to first add a few lines in the crust, just little sketch lines or scribble lines. I'm not coloring it all the way in. And then I'm going to start on the outside of the pie and add a few little sketch lines, just kind of following around the outside of the circle. And I'm going to make them get closer or further apart as I get closer to the middle. Then I'm going to layer in some yellow sketch lines, just random lines. I'm not trying to color it all the way in. And my lighter brown too. A couple different browns in there. And I might even take a little bit of my darkest brown and add a few sketch lines closest to the crust. Now for inside my little teardrop shapes, I want kind of an apple color. So you want to get sort of almost like a peach, maybe a peach color, or you could do like a light or medium brown. And I'm just going to add a couple of little scribble lines in there as well. All right, moving on to my pumpkin pie. I'm going to sort of repeat the same steps I did here, except instead of yellow, I'm going to be using the oranges. And I'm not going to, if you did put whipped cream on there, I'm not going to outline my whipped cream. So I'm going to start with some sketch lines around the outside of my pie. And for me, on this one, I can't even see the rest of the lines out there, but I will draw some lines along the edge of the spot that I cut out. Okay, a couple lines in my crust. It's my darkest brown. I'm going to switch to my medium brown, kind of overlap the darker ones and then go closer to the middle, working around my whipped cream dollops there so I don't turn them brown. And then my lighter brown. Oops. A couple different browns. I want the outside of the pie to look the most cooked. Now I'm going to take my orange and kind of add same sort of lines. I want to kind of follow the shape of the circle and just scribble in a few lines. Now, if you did add whipped cream, and before I do that, I'm going to do, if you did cut a slice out, make sure you get that inside nice and orange. And there's two different oranges. There's a tiger orange and then a regular orange. And the regular orange is much brighter. So I'm going to add less of that because I don't want my pie to look too orange, a little unnatural. So now I've got all my orange sketch lines in. I'm going to repeat the same steps for my slice here. If you added a slice of pumpkin pie, just make it look exactly like that one. I'm going to do the outside, the back, and the bottom here with a little darker brown first. Add a few sketch lines. Switch to my medium brown. Still not coloring everything in. I want to do most of my orange with that tiger orange. It's kind of a more pumpkin-y orange. And then maybe a few lines of my bright orange. All right. If you have whipped cream, you're going to want to outline it with gray. And you don't need any sketch lines. You're literally just going to trace the pencil lines. We're going to barely add any color because, of course, whipped cream is white. So the gray is really just to add shadows. I'm going to add a couple lines on the inside to give it a little texture. That's it. Now, for the remaining pieces, I've got plates or pie pans. You can use gray to just give the edge of your pie pan if it's showing. So this would only be the ones that have a slice cut out of them to give them a little bit of a shadow. And then the edges of the plates. And you don't have to use gray for this. You could make the edge of the plate a different color. But I'm going to go ahead and do mine in gray. I'll do this plate in blue so you can see that you can use any color here. And I'm just going to give my plate basically like a little bit of a shadow. If you wanted to make this plate look more like a dessert plate, you could add a second circle inside, but you'll want to kind of pick up and go around the pie. And this might be a little tricky because you still want to keep it round. So wherever your plate edge goes off the page, your inside edge would also go off the page. You don't have to do this part. It's just kind of an extra detail to make it look a little bit more like a plate. Sometimes they have that outer lip and then the flat part of the plate's on the inside and there's a little bit of a shadow there. Okay, now I'm ready to add my water. For this part, I'm going to have 2 paintbrushes, a smaller one, kind of a medium-sized one, and just a bowl of water. Now, I'm also going to need a little cloth to wipe my brushes on because the marker, the color, the pigment from the marker is going to come off on my brush. I'm going to start with my smaller brush. I'm just going to get it wet. And I'm kind of just going to swipe over my crusts first. And I'm going to do one color at a time. And I'm just barely kind of using the tip of my brush to paint over the edge of my pie crust and then blend the paint together. I'm not going back and forth a bunch of times because I kind of want to leave that texture of those scribbly lines. And I don't want to paint outside of my lines because that will make my brown marker bleed outside. And I'm going to do this on each one of my pies. And whenever my brush starts to get a little dry, I'm just adding a little water. But since I'm just using brown right now, I don't need to really wash it. Just blending all my crusts. Tiny, tiny bit of water, just using barely the tip of my brush. Now, whenever I switch colors, I do want to wash my brush. For the lattice pie, you're going to want to start with the brown parts and then let it dry a little bit. So I'm just taking a little water, wet brush, dragging it straight down, being really careful not to drag in the colors from my berries, those blues and pinks and purples. And I'm not going back and forth. I'm not really doing a whole lot here other than just swiping my paintbrush over the marker. And then once I've done all my vertical lines, I'm going to go back and do the brown ones. I'm really kind of taking my time to stay inside my lines, my grid lines, so I don't accidentally pull in the colors of the berries. I'm going to go back and blend the berries later after this marker has dried a little bit. So I'm going to wash my brush, move on to another pie. Oh, I guess I should do I'm going to do my slice. If you did do a slice of the berry pie, you can go ahead and blend the lattice pieces on that too. All right, now I'm going to wash my brush. I'm going to move on to my pumpkin pie. For this one, I'm going to start on the outside of the crust and just kind of move my brush back and forth. If you didn't put whipped cream, you could use your big brush for this part and just kind of go all the way around. But since I have whipped cream here, I'm going to have to use the very tip of my brush to go up to the edges of that gray marker. And just like on the berry pie, I'm not going to blend the gray marker until the orange has kind of dried a little bit. So I want to start with that curved brush strokes on the outside of the pie and then just sort of swipe it back and forth, blending my marker towards the center here. It's just like using watercolor. You don't want to get too much water. Every time I get water, I kind of drag my brush along the side to sort of squeeze off the extra. That's a good strategy for not ending up with puddles. But also you just want to keep blending that water until your brush starts to feel a little dry. Okay, and I'm also going to blend the side piece here. If you have a slice cut out of your pumpkin pie, you might want to blend this separately so it doesn't all mix together. And then I'm going to repeat those steps for my slice of pumpkin pie over here. Try to get my brush strokes kind of go in the same direction. You don't want to overblend because you'll lose a lot of your texture. Now, one thing to remember is next week, when this is dry, we're going to come back in and add more texture. So if you do overblend, it's not the end of the world. Just leave it. Don't try to add marker on top of wet areas. It will ruin our markers. I'm going to do the same thing for my apple pie here. I'm going to start on the outside of the crust, curved lines, and sort of blend towards the middle. Now the apple pie is kind of the lightest pie here, just those browns and yellows. So I might have to really drag my marker towards the center. Just kind of going in those round brush strokes. And I'm going to keep pulling that wet marker towards the middle. And then I'm just going to outline and fill my little vent holes on my pie crust here. I want to be careful not to blend all of this marker together, but I'm going to try to get some of that yellow in here without bleeding too much marker together so that none of my apple pie just looks white. And again, if you feel like you do need to add more marker, we can do that next time. Don't try to add it today. All right, now I can probably go back at this point. This is pretty dry, and go ahead and blend my berry colors. So I'm just going to start with my slice here. And again, don't overblend. You just want to fill in the white spots. You actually want to be careful not to overblend and lose that texture. Those squiggly lines, loopy lines we added makes it look more like there's little berry shapes in there. So I'm being really careful with the tip of my brush. If you get a little brown on it on accident, just wash it off so your berries are nice and brightly colored. And I'm just going square by square. Don't want a puddle, don't want it to drip. Might help if you kind of trace the outside and then go towards the middle. Be really careful here. Okay. And then I'm also going to blend my little slice here. And you'll notice that when I do the edges, I do kind of paint a line. I don't just go back and forth. I want to make sure that my lines on the outside edges stay nice and straight. And then each little square. All right. So now the only other things I'm going to blend, I'm going to wash my brush off here, are my whipped cream and my plate edges. So hopefully that's pretty dry. I'm just going to grab the edge of that whipped cream dollop, tiniest bit of water, and just barely blend those edges to make it look like it's got a little bit of a shadow. Barely any water on that paintbrush. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the edges of the plate. I'm going to just basically paint over the line. I'm not even going to rub it back and forth. I'm just going to drag my brush over the top, and that'll make the marker bleed just enough to create the slightest shadow. We are going to add a background, kind of like a tablecloth, in the empty space between our pies. but we're going to do that next week when all of our marker water is dry. Now, if you have an area like this where you've got a pie slice missing, you can pull that gray marker kind of more towards the center and fill that area. Just be careful not to drag in the colors of your pie. Just going to pull over the edges of my paint. If it bleeds too much, that's okay. We'll clean it up next time. All right, that's my stopping point for today. I've got all my marker blended, kind of added my shadow on my plates, and I'm finished for today.